had a question about recommendations for people who may not be able to live like a resident. I know that living like a resident is really the best option for maximizing savings, but my husband is currently working for a startup and doesn't have any income. But because he's working, we have to send our younger children to daycare. My older daughter just started kindergarten, and we really wanted to make sure she was in the best school district. So we ended up buying a fairly expensive house in that school district to make sure that she was in the area we wanted her to be, and she wouldn't have to move schools if we were to rent for a few years. Because of this, we have a lot of expenses that can't change. Our mortgage is much higher than I even like to think about, though I can cover it with my salary fairly easily right now. And then daycare expenses obviously add up pretty quickly. Because of this, we really can't live like residents. We are doing things like not buying new cars until our current ones give out, and we don't have any loans on those. So I'm trying. But I was wondering if you had any advice on what we can do to really maximize our savings, knowing that we have some pretty high expenses that really can't change. Thank you.
All right, Colleen, great question. Let's start by referring you to a blog post I put on the blog a number of years ago. It looks like I wrote it or published it in 2019, probably wrote it in 2018. It's titled, What to Do If You Forgot to Live Like a Resident. And I think you ought to go check that out. But here's the deal, right? I hear a lot of talk about your expenses, a lot of justification of this expense or that expense, and talk about what you're not spending money on. I don't care. I don't care what you're spending money on and what you're not spending money on. You don't get a pass on math. Okay? The math works the same no matter how you spend your money or what it gets spent on. What I did not hear is your savings rate, how much you're actually saving for retirement. And that is where you should focus, rather than the fact that you're spending money on a house, rather than you're not spending money on cars. It doesn't really matter whether you're spending the money on vacations or cars or houses or startup costs for a business. It doesn't matter. The math works the same. If you are saving enough, it's okay. Spend your money on whatever you want to spend your money on. I don't care. If you are not saving enough, you need to make some changes. Now, what those changes are have to be guided by your values, and maybe you can live in a cheaper house and send your kid to a private school and actually come out ahead. Maybe you can not go on vacations. Maybe you can not eat out. I don't know where you're going to save the money if you're not saving enough. But I can tell you this, most people that aren't saving enough don't actually have a budget. So actually get a budget, figure out where every dollar is going every month, and make sure it's going to the things you actually care about. There's probably some dollars that are going places that you don't care that much about, and cut those and save the money there. The other thing to keep in mind is this might be kind of short term, right? And only you can decide if it's short term. Maybe this startup is about to start making gobs of money and it's going to bail you out from any bad financial decision you ever made. Maybe you're about to make partner in your group and your income is about to double. I don't know. But in a lot of cases, if you're in a short-term situation, it turns out it's fine, right? Maybe people are just broke for a couple of years while they're paying on student loans, or maybe they're just, really don't have much money while they're still buying into a dental practice or something. I don't know. But if you're in a short-term situation, well, that's one thing. But if you're in a long-term situation, you calculate your savings rate and you're actually only saving 5% of your income and you don't see an end to that anytime soon. You can't increase your income. Well, you've got to start looking at saving more money. And that means spending less. And it doesn't matter what you spend less on, only you can decide that. But if you're only saving 5% of your net income, the numbers work out that you'll have a 66-year career. So if you started at 30, that means you work till you're 96. And that's usually enough to get people to motivate themselves enough to really look at a budget more carefully and figure things out. The other thing to keep in mind is, for the most part, people dramatically overestimate the difficulty of doubling their income. I've doubled my income a number of times during my career, and I can tell you it's not as hard as most people think it is. Whether that means asking for a raise, whether it means working more hours, whether it means moving to a different area of the country, whether that means doing some moonlighting on weekends, whether that means starting a business, whether it means being self-employed, whatever. A lot of times a higher income can bail you out of higher spending. And so don't just look at ways you can cut spending, also look at ways that you can increase income. Hopefully that's helpful. Make sure you do look at that blog post, and there's a lot of great tips in there. For example, maybe you can fire your financial advisor and do it yourself. That can save you some money if you learn how to do that. That's like a significant raise for many people. Maybe you're paying on a whole life insurance policy you don't need, or maybe your investments aren't as good as they could be. Maybe you're investing in stuff that isn't doing as well as it ought to be. You're in some high expense ratio mutual fund, or you're buying individual stocks, or something like that. Maybe you got the wrong term life or disability insurance coverage, and you can save some money there. But mostly, you just got to realize you don't get a pass on math. It doesn't matter where the money is being spent. You only have so much of it, and you've got to make sure you're saving enough money. Now, can you be okay by skipping a live like a resident period? You probably can. But that means you're still doing what you have to do after the live like a resident period, which is saving 20% of your gross for retirement. If you're doing that, you'll be okay eventually. You just won't build wealth quite as quickly as someone who's willing to live like a resident for 2 to 5 years, but you can still do it. But if your plan is to somehow not save enough money ever, that doesn't really work. And you eventually become one of those 11 to 12% of doctors in their 60s that have a net worth of less than $500,000, or one of those 25% of doctors in their 60s who are not yet millionaires. And they're out there. And the reason they're out there most of the time, although there's sometimes some bad things that happen to people, disabilities, et cetera, divorces, et cetera. But for the most part, those people are in that situation because they spent all their income year after year after year. Don't be one of those doctors. Some other things you might consider: some geographic arbitrage, changing jobs, changing houses. Our other podcast host, Dr. Disha Spath, she actually frugaled down. They moved to a cheaper house because they realized they were not reaching their financial goals. You might be able to lower your taxes. Might be able to put kids into public school. Sounds like you're already doing that. Might be able to downsize your cars, although it sounds like you're already driving something pretty inexpensive. You might have something else in the driveway. Maybe there's a boat or ATVs out there that you could sell. You can take fewer vacations. You can stop eating out. You can send your partner to work. I know your partner is getting involved in a startup, but you know what? Maybe he also has to have a side gig where he's actually earning money right now to help get that startup off the ground. Maybe you can find somebody to help with the daycare costs, whether that's friend, family, some other situation. That's also a possibility. And maybe you just have to spend less on your own and kids' activities to save more money. It's hard for me to say without going through your budget and knowing your values, but it shouldn't be that hard for you to say if you'll do that process. So I recommend you do.
The hosts of the YQA Investor Podcast are not licensed accountants, attorneys, or financial advisors. This podcast is free entertainment and information only. It should not be considered professional or personalized financial advice. You should consult the appropriate professional for specific advice relating to your situation.